Hello, my people. How are we doing? So week 3 of Instruments of the Orchestra. We have our same really well-drawn chart. Super duper art skills on hand here. And so far we've gone through 2 of the families that make up the orchestra. Quick reminder, we started, this right here would be where the audience sits. We have up front the conductor to basically keep everyone on the same page, get us starting together, stopping together, and moving together for the most part. The biggest section right up front, that belongs to the strings. 5 instruments in that family: harp, violin, viola, cello, and bass, okay? Behind that, we have woodwind, we have brass. We're gonna talk a little bit about both of those today and then focus in on one. And then all the way kind of winding around the back is the percussion. And I named 5 string instruments that go here. I talked about a bunch of different percussion instruments last week, but we didn't try to put a number on it, and we definitely did not exhaustively list all of them because it's just really not doable. There's too many instruments. We said one thing that really kind of sets the percussion group apart from the rest of the orchestra is that the players in that section aren't usually going to be tied to one instrument. If it's a larger instrument that appears a lot in multiple songs, then you'll have one person kind of hanging out around the snare drum. You'll have one person hanging out and playing primarily on the piano, which I don't believe we mentioned, but is part of the percussion family. But for the most part, the majority of percussionists in the orchestra are auxiliary players, meaning they move from small instrument to small instrument. So for today and next week, we're going to be talking about wind instruments, which is a big, broad term that covers every single instrument that you have to blow into if you want it to make sound. Wind instruments use air to create vibration, and that's what's basically going to get the sound out of it. Now, both woodwind instruments and brass instruments both fall into the category of wind instruments. Every instrument we're going to look at for the next 2 weeks, or talk about for the next 2 weeks, is a wind instrument. But today we're going to focus in on brass. You know, what I've been telling you guys about the difference between woodwind and brass is these ones are mostly made of wood, and they're going to handle air a little bit differently. I just kind of haven't filled you in on how yet. Mostly that'll be next week's focus. Today, we'll focus on the fact that brass instruments are not only made of metal, but that they handle air in a very, very different way than the woodwind family, okay? Now, it's also kind of a small family, which is cool, coming off of all of that stuff we went over with the percussion family being so absurdly large. There's only about 4 instruments. It can vary, but there's pretty much just 4 instruments in the brass family as far as the orchestra is concerned. There's going to be the trumpet, the trombone, the French horn, and the tuba. You might have something called a baritone horn or a euphonium, same instrument, different names. That could push it out to 5, but you could definitely get by with 4. There are other brass instruments, not a ton, but a lot of them are just kind of like the wacky relatives. There's the flugelhorn, there's the flumpet, there is the cornet, there is the bugle, and you might have heard of some of those, but they're not widely used. The 4 I mentioned, trumpet, trombone, French horn, and tuba, those are really going to be the ones we see pop up. And one thing that they all have in common is this piece right here, okay? This is actually kind of a miniature brass instrument. It's the mouthpiece that's going to go into any one of these instruments, and it's going to look mostly the same on any one of those 4, but it'll be different sizes. For example, the trumpet is not a large instrument, and because of that, it's going to create high pitches. The tuba is very, very big, and because of that, its really only company is the piano and the bass that we looked at a couple weeks ago as far as which instruments can make the absolute lowest sounds. So a tuba is going to have a much bigger mouthpiece than a trumpet, but they'll work the same. There are 2 parts to this mouthpiece. This part right here is going to be the part that gets put into the instrument. And this part right here is called the cup. And it the cup is mostly responsible for the sound coming out. Now, if you don't know much about brass instruments or wind instruments in general, you might think that you can just blow in this and that's all there is to it. But all you hear when you do that is air. And it's because the brass family kind of approaches vibration in a different way than any other family. With the percussion, we had to make those instruments vibrate, whether it was by shaking it, rattling it, scraping it, hitting it with a drumstick or a mallet. We forced those instruments to vibrate and they would create the sound. Strings, we would pluck the strings or we would bow the strings, but it was the strings that made the sound. This is not going to make the sound. You are going to make the sound, and that's really something that makes brass different. They're a very lazy family of instruments. They don't want to do the work. They're just going to take the work you put in and make it louder. So what we have to do is we have to work on a technique called buzzing our lips, which does not mean making a buzzing sound like a bee. In fact, we're not going to make any sound like we would by talking or by singing or anything like that. Instead, we're going to basically vibrate our lips, which is probably a more accurate way of thinking of the sound we're going to make. So what we do, and you can try this along with me, is we're going to lick our lips just a little bit. If they're a little bit damp, this works a whole lot better. And then we're going to push them together and we're going to force air out. And it takes a little bit of practice to get it just right, okay? If you push your lips together too tight, you end up going like this. The air can't get out. Obviously, we need the air to get out. If you don't make them tight enough, you end up going and making the sound of a horse. What we want is the sound of an elephant, kind of like this. Okay, and we want to get as much air coming out front and center as possible. We don't want the air shooting out the sides or anything like that. Now, once you kind of get that down, then we take this, okay? And we can buzz into the mouthpiece. We rest it on our lips and we do the exact same motion, that kind of elephant sound. And day one of learning how to play a brass instrument is just figuring out how to get the thing to make sound. After that, you move on to how to control that sound. If you tighten your lips a teeny tiny bit more, it's going to make the air come out of kind of a smaller area, and it's going to go faster, and it's going to make the sound higher. If you loosen your lips a little bit, we don't want that horse thing going on, but just a little bit, then the air moves slower and the sound that comes out is a little deeper. And if you really work at that, like brass players have to, you can eventually play songs using just the mouthpiece. Okay? Now, if only playing brass instruments were that easy, but once we put the instrument together, there's a little bit more to it. But before I do that, I want to show you just one more little buzz song on here. Okay? Just to prove that I can, in fact, play the beginning of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star on this thing. Okay? Now, once we put this entire thing together, the sound is still coming from the same place, okay? The rest of this is going to serve to make it louder, okay? Now, I'm not going to point it directly at the camera because it's going to be so loud, the sound coming out of here, that it's probably going to mess with the audio. So you're going to see me kind of turn to the side. Were we in class, this is exactly what I do, not play directly at people, but instead play to the side so the sound doesn't get directed straight at somebody's ears, okay? So this is the sound we kind of get out of it. Okay, whole lot louder, a little bit more musical, at least it would be if I was an experienced brass player, but hey, I can walk you through this at the very least. Now, one thing that brass instruments are going to do differently than woodwind instruments is when we see a woodwind instrument next week, we're going to notice they're kind of full of holes. This one, not so much. In fact, the air, which starts its journey in the mouthpiece, is going to travel all the way down here, comes around the bend here, there's places for it to outlet here, in the back, comes around here, and finally it makes its way all the way to this, the bell of the instrument. So that air has kind of a long journey. Now, just like we change the sound of a string instrument by pushing down to make the string shorter or longer, we're going to make this instrument shorter or longer, not by squishing it down or anything like that, but by using these valves, okay? Now, before I kind of show you how those work, let's bring back that Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. Pretty good start, right? Okay, so listen to where it goes from there. Kind of goes off the rails after those first two notes, and the reason for that is because without using these valves, those three buttons right there, I can't change the pitch, okay? What's really cool about these, they might look like you're just pushing down to cover a hole or something, but if we take this out, there's a whole lot more to it. It kind of looks like Swiss cheese in there. What happens is, when we push that down, it changes the path that the air can take through the instrument. Those holes that we saw in the valve, now, this kind of maze right here is lined up a little bit differently. And there's several different ways that we can put down combinations of valves. You can do the first one, second one, third one, first and second third, first and third, all three, or none of them. And depending on how we send the air through the instrument, we're going to get different pitches out of that. So if I want Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, I can start off by not pushing anything, but after a minute, I gotta kind of rely on these valves a little bit more. Little bit more clean on that one, wouldn't you say? And we can go kind of all the way through our do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, using different combinations of those valves. All the way up to that high note, okay? So, couple other little things. We're only looking at trumpet today, but that doesn't mean that we can't learn about the other three instruments that are in the brass family. Now, tuba and French horn are mostly going to work the same way. They might look a little bit different, whether it be their size or the way that these tubes kind of curl so that you can hold it in your hand. If we made this trumpet one straight line, it would go probably 15 feet that way, and it wouldn't be very easy to carry around. The only one that really works a little bit differently is the trombone, but honestly, it's a little easier to understand. Now, all brass instruments have something like this, where you can bring it out, you can bring it back in, you can take it off, but the instrument doesn't sound because we've kind of broken the loop that the air has to travel through. Thing is, that if we pull this out but don't take it off, we've made the instrument a little bit longer. And I hope we remember at this point that the bigger an instrument is, the lower the sound it's going to make. The smaller it is, the higher the sound it's going to make. Now, a trombone, the slide on that is much, much bigger than this. You would have to hold it all the way out to here to kind of get the full effect. But we can still hear it a little bit, just kind of playing with the trumpet. Okay, so we still kind of get that slide. It's a little bit of fun. I think it is anyway. So last thing I'll show you is I'll just play a little song using some valves, using some open keys, and just kind of hearing what the trumpet can do. And before I do that, before I let you go, I do want to point out that the brass ends up behind the woodwinds for a reason. And the reason is they're much louder than the woodwinds. Remember, when we came up with this entire setup, we were doing it because there was no way to put microphones in front of these instruments. They didn't exist yet. So we had to put the loud instruments in the back and have a few less of them, and the quieter instruments up front and have more of them, so that by the time the sound travels to the audience, everything sounds nice and balanced. All right, guys, that's brass, that's the idea. Keep some of that in mind, because we're gonna talk a lot about it next week, because when we talk about woodwinds, we're gonna need to compare how these instruments that we talked about today work versus how the ones that will pop up next week are going to work. It's not just gonna be a matter of we do the exact same thing, but these ones are wood. We're gonna see the air travels through and create sound in different ways in those woodwind instruments. So I will see you next week. Hope you enjoyed. Bye-bye.